Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, destroyed other letters between Lincoln and Steed. So we have to ask ourselves, why would he want to? He commits his mother and destroys letters written between Lincoln and Steed. Why would he want to do that? But we want to talk about why Lincoln still matters. Sometimes when we talk about history, we wonder, well, why does that matter? Why are we talking about this? That was 100 years ago, 100, 200 years ago, it was 1,000 years ago. What relevance does it have to us today? And so Lincoln actually, surprisingly, to some, actually has a lot of relevance to us today. A lot of the things that we do today is because of the things that Lincoln did, things that happened during his administration, and because of the war during his administration. And so it's what goes on and the changes that happened, especially in the beginning, to the Constitution and what the founding fathers set up, and then what happened during the Lincoln administration is very relevant to what we face today. And it's really important that we understand that. And so we encourage everyone to increase their knowledge. And so in addition to what we do here at the Tree of Liberty Society, I want to encourage everyone to increase their own knowledge, whether it's, reading books, studying different topics and from different perspectives. But the Lord says that his people perish for lack of knowledge. And so it's important that we take that personal responsibility upon us, that we go out and find ways to be able to increase our knowledge so that we are not the cause of the perishing of the people. And what we're doing here at the Tree of Liberty Society, our purpose is to build an understanding and adherence to the principles that have built free nations, to expose the satanic conspiracy that we face that is a threat to our freedom, and then to build an effective resistance to that conspiracy. It doesn't do us any good to just know about the conspiracy. We have to actually take steps to resist and thwart that conspiracy. And so that is what we are doing at the Tree of Liberty Society. So let's get into Lincoln and his place in our culture. This is, there is a lot of praise. You'll see memes like these pop up all over the place about how Republicans and Lincoln freed the slaves, and that, those Democrats are they're upset, and they're only mad. I mean, they haven't been this mad since Lincoln freed the slaves. And then we have this one where there's this idea that it was the Republicans freed the slaves, and now their descendants vote for Democrats, and he doesn't understand. He's confused. And these are popular misconceptions that are in the media today that we will actually cover tonight. But it's just kind of giving an idea of what do we see the culture? Where is Lincoln in the culture? We see, especially in the Republican Party, each county usually will have all across the Union will have Lincoln Day dinners, Lincoln Day celebrations, where they have a speaker come out, and it's supposed to be patriotic and loving of the Constitution and the principles of Americanism. And so they equate, a lot of times you'll see people equate Lincoln with one of the founding fathers. You have, and this is something that is ingrained in us since we were children. You have here this example of second graders being visited by an actor playing Abraham Lincoln, and putting him in this light to the kids of a hero and somebody that they should look up to. And then this video is of something of school children in Hawaii and a celebration that they have every year.
Good morning and aloha, everyone. It's great to be here for the 75th annual Lincoln Day program. Governor Ige's father and my father went to Eva Elementary School, and I attended Eva Elementary School. There's so many memories, so many things that we've learned that we carry through our lives, and it all started here for me at Eva Elementary School.
Make you happy and great, a lay of love I give to you.
Grades 5 and 6.
To think of me when you are blue.
Okay, today we celebrate the 75th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln. We unveiled the statue in 1944 with student performances, which we carry on today. Some of the traditions we have are the reciting of the Gettysburg Address, the Royal Hawaiian Band, and a lot of student performance and speeches. Recently we added the Lincoln Day essay contest, and that winning essay was read today. It's always a special day when we have Lincoln Day, whether it's the 75th annual or just every year's Lincoln Day is as special as any other. And we thank the parents for supporting us and our faculty and staff for all their hard work.
Okay, so we see the schools also coming on and developing this culture and building this culture of individual, of children, raising them up to adults, instilling in them this, frankly, what we saw with that statue and their adoration of Abraham Lincoln on this idol. And then we have this also in politics.
Abraham Lincoln is in the house. My homeboy from Illinois, and an outstanding Republican endorsee. There you go.
So we have the uniparty, you have the Republicans with their Lincoln Day dinners. You have Democrats also promoting and adoring Abraham Lincoln. It is a unified message that you are supposed to love Abraham Lincoln. And then we have a talking head talking about Lincoln. That is something that is talked about and promoted even amongst radio talk show hosts.
I can't tell you how much I admire Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's a guy, comes out of a rural upbringing, no formal education whatsoever, no uncle in the business, doesn't trade favors like all the others did, basically is lucky to get elected because he makes a speech in New York City that catches the eye of some big-time newspaper people. And he walks in, he goes, I'm going to have to save this country. I'm going to have to save the Union. And I know it's going to be horrible, but I'm going to have to do it. And he did it.
So that makes him the best president.
By far.
By far.
Lincoln did bring a sense of morality into the White House with him. So Lincoln, he was driven to free the slaves, but at the same time, he didn't want to collapse the country. And he managed to do both. Therefore, he's number one.
And he's number one by far, he says. And so this is something that we see all over. And then we have not only Bill O'Reilly talking about how Lincoln is by far the best president that we've ever had. Forget John Adams, forget Thomas Jefferson, forget George Washington. By far, Lincoln is the best. And then amongst mainstream historians, that same idea is permeated. We have the top 10 presidents. Again, Lincoln is number one in the survey of historians. Not only a survey of historians, but similar surveys just amongst the population at large. Lincoln is always just number one on all of the mainstream lists of best presidents in the history of the United States. And so just laying that foundation, we understand that, Lincoln's place in the culture is the establishment loves Lincoln and they want you to love him too. So why is that? It's important, right? To understand, is it just why the conspiracy? Of course, they want to undermine freedom. And so there's a reason behind everything that they do. Usually Satanists and people that are evil and that are working to destroy liberty aren't going to be promoting somebody that is promoting liberty and promoting good and promoting righteousness. And so why is the establishment so hell-bent on using government schools, using the media, using politicians and political parties to instill into us that Lincoln is the best president America has ever had? Why? Why is that? And so to understand that, we have to look at the history as well as his record and what that means to us today. Okay. So in that interview, Bill O'Reilly talked about the people that Lincoln caught their eye. Well, who are the people that, Lincoln didn't just come from nowhere. He was put there by individuals. And there's an organization behind putting someone in place as president. And so these people that were promoted Abraham Lincoln was a group of Rosicrucians, and this is their committee of three, their leading council of the Rosicrucians during this time period. And just a little bit about this committee of three that were behind promoting Abraham Lincoln in all of the national establishment media across the Union during this time frame to ensure that he was elected. And there was more to it than just the propaganda machine behind him. But we look at George Lippard. George Lippard, he created a subgroup called within the Rosicrucians called the Brotherhood of the Union, and they published anti-Christian and pro-socialist ideologies. So what he was engaged in, what the Rosicrucians were engaged in, was anti-Christian and pro-socialist, pro-communist. Same thing we have here with Pascal Randolph. He was part of the Asiatic Brethren, a tentacle of the Bulgarian Illuminati, and he was involved in the French Revolution, and the Asiatic Brethren were involved in the French Revolution. And just a little bit of background, the French Revolution, that was orchestrated by a group called the Jacobins, who were also a tentacle or the next incarnation of the Bulgarian Illuminati. And he was also heavily involved in the spiritualist and occult movement in the States. Another organization that was a part of this tentacled beast to get Lincoln into office was a group called the Turners, or in German, the Turnvarians. They were a socialist gymnastics union on the face, but they were led by socialists and communists, and they were engaged in promoting that agenda within the United States. And they created the first militias used by Lincoln's army in the war against the South. Also, you have the Wide Awake Republicans, or WAR, so probably would be what would be considered like neocon Republicans today. They were founded by the socialist terrorist Allan Pinkerton, who got 400,000 of their members to campaign for Lincoln. Now, that's a lot of people to campaign for somebody today, but just think about how much smaller the states were back then, the population of the Union was at the time, and what kind of impact that would have with this socialist terroristic organization campaigning for the candidate Lincoln. And so these organizations, these individuals that were behind getting Lincoln elected, didn't just use their propaganda, didn't just use their members to get the vote out, but they actually, just like we see today, manipulated the election to ensure that their candidate won. So we see here the organizations behind Lincoln's rise made sure that non-citizens were allowed to vote in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. A lot of them Germans, going back to the Turner Society, and their efforts to get non-citizen Germans in the United States to be able to vote to ensure that their candidate won. So again, we talk about illegals, today, swerving elections one direction or another. That same tactic was used during the election for Abraham Lincoln to ensure that he was elected as well. So you have the establishment, the conspirators working together to promote them in the media, to get the vote out, as well as to manipulate the vote to ensure that their guy won. Also, we have Abraham Lincoln and his wife were very much into the occult. We had seances and other occult practices. They were normal at the Lincoln White House. Lincoln received advice from spirits, and there was regular use of mediums, and apparitions were claimed to even been seen by people that were involved in this occult activity within the Lincoln White House. Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham's wife, was eventually committed to an insane asylum under the direction of her son for her obsession with the occult. He was really worried about her using up the family fortune and that she was not safe to herself and others. And so her own son had her committed after Lincoln's death because of her involvement in the occult. Also, we have Lincoln and Joshua Steed, who were likely had a sodomite style relationship. So we're going to go through that information. Those two shared a bed together for 4 years, even after Lincoln could afford his own home. So people bring out, they say, well, that was kind of normal back then for individuals to share a bed, for men to share a bed together, even if they weren't sodomites. But the reason why it started was because Lincoln could not afford it. But then as his career took off and he was able to get more money, he still, even though he could afford to have his own place, decided to continue to share his bed with Joshua Steed. And then in a letter from Lincoln to Joshua, he says, quote, "You know I am miserable and you wish to give me the means of being happy." Another letter later on that year, he says, quote, "You have now been the husband of a lovely woman nearly 8 months. I doubt not you are happier now than you ever were before." End of quote. So he's saying that, just because you're married now, you're not happier now because you're married to a woman than you were before with me. Joshua Steed, talking about his relationship with Lincoln, said, "Not two men were ever more intimate, and I loved him then as I do now." Pretty self-evident. So historians note that Lincoln's letters to Steed actually were more intimate than any he wrote to women, including his wife. Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, destroyed other letters between Lincoln and Steed. So we have to ask ourselves, why would he want to? He commits his mother and destroys letters written between Lincoln and Steed. Why would he want to do that? Okay. Now, during the war, Lincoln has a northern congressman, Clement Vallandigham, deported for giving speeches opposing the war against Southern secession. So there was no trial, there was no conviction, just because this Ohio congressman was like, hey, this war is not just, it's not a good war. Lincoln says, okay, we're kicking you out. And there were lots of individuals in positions of power that recognized the illegitimacy and the unconstitutionality of Lincoln's actions against the Southern states that wanted independence. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, was threatened with arrest in an attempt to silence him for his judicial opinion that Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional. So, in fact, it wasn't just a threat of arrest. He actually did he had an arrest warrant issued to get the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to stop saying that his suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional. So we have the courts flat out saying that what he was doing was wrong. So what is habeas corpus and why is suspending it such a bad thing? Was Roger Taney just some radical leftist that didn't like Lincoln so-called freeing the slaves? Well, habeas corpus is a writ requiring a person under arrest to be brought before a judge or into court, especially to secure the person's release, unless lawful grounds are shown for their detention. So Lincoln was saying, no, I'm going to just arrest people that I don't like, that is doing things or saying things that I don't like. So he would do that to reporters. He would do that to congressmen. He would do that to just anyone. And he would just arrest them indefinitely because there was no due process. They weren't brought before a court or a judge to see if the charges against them were legitimate. He suspended the ability for due process to happen. And so he was able to use his influence and his power as president to silence and imprison anyone that was critical of him and his administration. So some truth, things that debunk the myths about why Lincoln went to war against the southern states that wanted independence. He says, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. And as we see further on, we're going to quote, what he means by saving the Union is by compelling membership and obedience to the federal government, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. So the war called the Civil War was not to stop slavery. It was to ensure that states did not leave and that they were obedient to the federal government. He says, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. So he didn't care. Freeing the slaves, he didn't care one way or the other. It was about the end. It was the means to an end. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. He didn't care about the slaves, didn't care about slavery. It was all about ensuring the compulsion of the states, the creator of the Constitution and of the Union. And further on in Lincoln's inaugural address, he talks about this so-called saving of the Union. So how does he want to preserve the Union? In doing this, enforcing the will of the feds, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authorities. So he's like, I don't want to have any bloodshed or violence, but if it's forced upon us, there's nothing we can do about it. So what would force him to engage in bloodshed and violence? The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. So that's what it was about. It was about collecting taxes. It was about keeping land that had been claimed by the general government. And so if you've, and this is really important to understand, because if you've seen two of my other presentations that I've posted on our YouTube channel and our website recently about the original creation of the Union, what was it that the founding fathers created? That it was a voluntary union amongst still sovereign nations that combined together for specific delegated purposes. And that the founding fathers were unanimous in the idea. The father of the Constitution, James Madison, was really adamant in the fact that the states did not give up their independence, that the Constitution did not create a new nation, and that the individual states or nations retained everything that they had before they joined the Union. They did not create a national government, but they created a federal government. And federal, as I point out in the video, means contract. So there's not a national government, it is a federal government. And so when he talks about occupying and possessing the property and places belonging to the government, he's talking about these forts and whatnot of these individual nations. And so you have places like South Carolina and Georgia that had forts and military outposts that every independent free nation has, and that they're militias that are guaranteed within the Constitution to be able to defend themselves against oppression from either the general government or from anyone else. That he was now claiming that property of these individual nations as his own, and that he would willingly use bloodshed and violence to invade these independent sovereign nations to impose his will on them. On another occasion, so we look through what did he do? He invaded South Carolina without a declaration of war. You can't invade a sovereign nation without declaring war. It's very clear, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress has to do that. Arrested thousands of even northern citizens without cause. Northern citizens that were against his war of aggression, against nations that wanted independence. He would just arrest them and put them away. And so that everyone that was out there was people that supported his cause, kind of like what we see in more recent times where, only the approved scientists or the approved doctors get to keep their credentials. And so that way they can say, all scientists agree in global warming. All doctors agree that that the fake pandemic vaccine is safe and effective. That same idea that he would do with citizens and government officials is put away anyone that didn't agree with what he was doing. And then also he blockaded southern ports without a congressional declaration of war. He imprisoned without trial hundreds of newspaper editors and owners, censoring all newspaper and telegraph communication. And he ordered federal troops to interfere with northern elections to assure his party's victories. So because he knew that the Democrats at that point in time, very different than, the Democrats, of course, wanted to have Southern independence. And so they were going to be against what Lincoln and the Republicans were doing to usurp the Constitution and destroy the independence of the states. And so he needed to interfere, just like his election was interfered with to ensure that he was elected. He continued that program of interfering with elections to ensure that the Republican Party continued to have majority power in Congress. And then he had his generals attack U.S. cities full of women and children and burnt them to the ground, killing innocent individuals. This wasn't a war of army against army, but these were armies, northern armies, sent to the southern states that had declared independence to kill not only soldiers, but men, women, and children, and burn their cities to the ground to get them to comply. The list goes on and on. And so I encourage anybody to look up on YouTube Thomas DeLorenzo and his videos on the real Lincoln. He's got some books on that topic. The Abbeville Institute has a lot of good information as well on the war crimes of Abraham Lincoln that were a violation of the United States Constitution and the tradition of the Founding Fathers. So the list goes on and on. And so, you'll have some people, they'll say, sure, Lincoln wasn't perfect. I would say these are far worse than not being perfect. But, they're going to say that, but he couldn't be that bad, right? Because didn't he appear with others and demand to have his work done? This is mostly going to be amongst Latter-day Saints. They're under the impression that Lincoln appeared to Wilford Woodruff with other eminent men and women to demand that their work be done for them. And so they'll say, well, maybe that those things are true, but maybe those aren't the full story, because how could he do that if he was able to come as a spirit and demand his temple work be done for him? And so let's look at the record. We have Wilford Woodruff in his journal for August 21st, 1877. Wilford Woodruff says, I, Wilford Woodruff, went to the temple of the Lord this morning and was baptized for 100 persons who were dead, including the signers of the Declaration of Independence, except John Hancock and William Floyd. So it wasn't because those guys were bad. They had already had their work done just earlier in the year. So right here, we don't hear any reference of anybody appearing. It's just the fact that he just did work for these people that were prominent in history. We have here James Bleak, who was a clerk to Brigham Young, was there that day when Wilford Woodruff did the work for these individuals. And this is his record. He says, I was also present in the St. George Temple and witnessed the appearance of the spirits of the signers. So he's very specific of which spirits came, the spirits of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. These men, which men? The signers of the Declaration of Independence, laid the foundation of this American government and signed the Declaration of Independence, and were the best spirits of God, the God of heaven, could find on the face of the earth to perform this work. So we have him saying that the only spirits that came that he named were those that signed the Declaration of Independence. Do we have more information, though? Wilford Woodruff, in a talk that he gave in conference, he says, 2 weeks before I left St. George, the spirits of the dead gathered around me, wanting to know why we did not redeem them. Said they, we'll get to who, you have had the use of the endowment house for a number of years, and yet nothing has ever been done for us. We laid the foundation of the government you now enjoy, and we never apostatized from it, but we remained true to it and were faithful to God. These were the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so we have the two individuals that were there that were engaged in this, and the only people that they named as not having their work done for them, but the ones that actually appeared and asked to have their work done for them were solely the signers of the Declaration of Independence. That's it. Nobody else was mentioned ever as having been there except the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, on another occasion, Wilford Woodruff says, "I'm going to bear my testimony to this assembly, if I never do it again in my life, that those men who laid the foundation of this American government and signed the Declaration of Independence were the best spirits the God of heaven could find on the face of the earth. They were choice spirits, not wicked men. General Washington and all the men that labored for the purpose were inspired of the Lord." Okay? The people that he's talking about, the signers of the Declaration of Independence. This is all that they mention ever. In any occasion when they mention those that appeared, it is only the signers of the Declaration of Independence. If you're a Latter-day Saint, we need to get that out of our head, this idea that everyone that had their work done for them that day were the ones that demanded it. The only ones that were worthy enough to come there and have their work, to ask to have their work done for them, if you're a believing Latter-day Saint, were the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Okay? Another thing I'm going to say here, because I have a right to say it. Every one of those men that signed the Declaration of Independence with General Washington called upon me as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ in the temple at St. George 2 consecutive nights and demanded at my hands that I should go forth and attend to the ordinances of the house of God for them. So again, right, even right up to his death, he's saying that the only people that came to him were Washington, the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Nobody else, not Lincoln. Okay. So, but Lincoln checked out the Book of Mormon, we'll say. That, yeah, okay, maybe he didn't, that there was the signers that came, but he was obviously a friend of the Latter-day Saints. He was obviously a good guy, so that's why he had his work done for him. Well, let's look at the fact. Okay, we have a list. We actually have a list of the books on Mormonism that Abraham Lincoln checked out. And he checked them out. This is like a stack of books. He's like, okay, I need these books about Mormonism, and I'm going to check them out of the Library of Congress. What's that list of books that he got, right? This is the books on Mormonism checked out by Abraham Lincoln. We have the Book of Mormon. We have The Mormons by John W. Gunnison. We have Mormonism, Its Leaders and Designs by John Hyde. Mormonism in All Ages by J.B. Turner. The Mormons, or Latter-day Saints in the Valley of the Great Salt Lake by Captain John W. Gunnison. John W. Gunnison, just as a side note, was a general or a captain in the U.S. Army that was told that he could just have his way with the Mormon women as part of his service to the United States. And so he's the one writing this book about the Mormons. So these latter 4 books were all anti-Mormon publications. Okay, so the books that he took out, that he was reading about the Mormons, the only one that was a representation from a friendly perspective would be the Book of Mormon itself. Every other book that he checked out was antagonistic towards the Latter-day Saints. So what he did here was not, it wasn't like, oh my goodness, I read the Book of Mormon and now I'm a friend to the Union. I'm a friend to the Latter-day Saints. No, that's not what happened at all. He was studying his enemy. He was not becoming friendly to the saints at all in any way, shape, or form. In fact, we have leaders like Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff who spoke about Abraham Lincoln and his character, and as contemporaries, as those that knew him and what kind of man that he was. And so let's look at that, because sometimes people will say, well, he became friendly. But this is what Brigham Young says. Abe Lincoln was no friend of Christ, particularly. He had never raised his voice in our favor when he was aware that we were being persecuted. Okay? Abe Lincoln was no friend of Christ. So when he has these quotes where he says, "I don't care if I was, if I'm on God's side, I just want God to. If God is on my side, I just want to make sure I'm on God's side." This is all just rhetoric because he knows his audience and what they want to hear. Brigham Young says Lincoln is no friend of Christ. He says, again, old Abe, the president of the United States, has it in his mind to pitch into us when he had got through with the South. So again, this is after the war between the states. And he's saying that after, his idea was not to just, this is after his death. So if he had repented, Brigham Young would say, well, okay, he changed his mind towards the end of the war. No, he's saying this is after the death of Lincoln. He's saying if he had still been around and gotten rid of the South, it was Abe Lincoln's position was to go against the Saints in Utah. And then he says this, he says, he, meaning Lincoln with many others, had assented to the deaths of innocent men, talking about Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. And through that, he is subject to the influence of a wicked spirit. And so Brigham Young, being in Nauvoo, being in Illinois during this time period, knowing and being associated with people in the Illinois legislature, knew Lincoln and knew Lincoln's association with the Saints and knew that Lincoln had assented, meaning agreed to, had maybe even part of and behind the scenes, the deaths of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Wilford Woodruff records Brigham Young as saying, "I am not in league with such cursed scoundrels as Abe Lincoln and his minions. They have sought our destruction from the beginning." So Lincoln was against the Saints from the time in the Illinois legislature, and he was against the Saints up until his death. He was not a friend to the Saints. He did not check out the Book of Mormon and all of a sudden have a change of heart. It was his continued life's work to promote the things that the people that got him into power and that he promoted as a radical Republican when he was, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, that was just like the Wide Awake Republicans. Radical Republican was another group of Republicans, the name that they called themselves, of socialists and communists amongst the Republicans during the 1860s. And that they were enemies to liberty, they were enemies to the Union, they were enemies to the Latter-day Saints. And so, no, Lincoln did not appear to them. Lincoln was not a friend to the Saints. He was not a part of that call to have work done for them. So we can have that attitude and that mindset just totally removed from our zeitgeist. Okay? So there's a reason the conspiracy created the hero of Lincoln. There's a reason. Again, as I asked in the very beginning, why has the conspiracy over the last 160 some odd years created this hero, this idol of Abraham Lincoln? This is the legacy of Lincoln and his so-called Civil War. Because of what happened during the war, it ended the contract of sovereign republics and then now created this single so-called indivisible nation that we're brainwashed with as children, establishing a repeat and need for the Declaration of Independence, rebellion against this newly formed nation. So if you are you're an independent nation, as we saw during the 1860s, and you did not want to be a part of this union anymore, and you wanted to declare independence, just like the 13 colonies did from England, you are no longer allowed to, because the so-called Civil War settled that question. We were no longer a confederation of sovereign republics, but now we've been compelled to be a part of this indivisible nation where we are now subdivisions of a tyrannical federal government. Also, another part of the legacy of Lincoln and the so-called Civil War that they want to promote so heavily and get ingrained into us, and so that we support it, is the idea of the Declaration of Independence erasing this concept that when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another. Okay, that is what That is why we are not part of England anymore. Because when it becomes necessary for them to dissolve, that is their right to dissolve. But after that, the Utah Constitution is an example of every single state that joined the Union after the 1860s. And it says the state of Utah is an inseparable part of the federal union. So now we've repealed the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and now we are simply here to do the bidding of this tyrannical general government. And that is what all post-Civil War states have in their state's constitution. Complete repudiation and disavowal of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the other legacy of Lincoln in the so-called Civil War is that with them, they created the supremacy of the central government over the once sovereign states, equating any resistance to federal authority as wanting to abuse Black people. And that is something you're always going to see whenever a state or whenever a politician or anybody brings up the idea of nullification, of going against what the federal government does. And anybody that says we need to abide by the 10th Amendment of the Constitution that says that anything that the government wasn't authorized to do, they're not allowed to do, they equate that with slavery and with abusing Black people. Let me just give you one example of that. We could give you a ton of examples of everything that we've gone over, and so I encourage you to go study on your own, but just for time's sake, we're just going to give you this one example that you probably heard a million times either on talk radio, television, or politicians. We have in Tennessee in 2009, the state legislator Susan Lynn introduced a bill that would nullify Obamacare in the state of Tennessee. Because under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution says, in Article 9 as well, Amendment 9, that anything that the federal government is not authorized to do, that they are not allowed to do. So if you were not specifically given that power in the Constitution, you're not allowed to do that. And so clearly, forcing people to buy a product or stealing from others to give others a product is nowhere authorized in the Constitution of the United States. So that means the federal government is clearly not allowed to introduce and pass legislation such as Obamacare in any of its forms. And so nullifying it and saying, you know what, in our state, Tennessee, we are not going to enforce that law, and we're going to protect our people from any penalties that the federal government would want to put on that. Okay? Simple, nothing to do with slavery. In fact, it's anti-slavery because it's saying that you're allowed to do what you want. You're not forced to buy health care. You're not forced to have your money taken from you so somebody else can buy health care. It's anti-slavery. But then we have Representative Mike Turner responding to the bill, says, Representative Susan Lynn's comments harken back to Civil War era arguments, yearning for times gone by. Maybe we could put the Black people back to sharecropping and slavery. We've already had that fight about states' rights, right? So again, he's just like anytime you bring this up, anybody that's against nullification, against the Constitution and its limitation on the federal government, they will go back to, oh, you want to nullify federal government action? Clearly, you want to put Black people back as slaves. Clearly, you want to, undo what was so-called settled by Abraham Lincoln and his so-called Civil War. And so that's the mindset that is the legacy that we have today, that we are no longer a part of a confederation of independent sovereign republics, that we've given the federal government limited, specific, enumerated powers, but now we have a all-powerful federal government that Congress says that they can do whatever they want, and that if you attempt to stand up to them, any attempt to stand up to them is automatically used as a smear to smear you as somebody that's in favor of abusing others. And so what this is really about is the deification of Lincoln is really about the deification of the government. We have all of these idols to one individual because of what he did is what allows the government to do what they do today, supposedly allows them. And so to prevent us from stopping them, we have this worship of this man. And so that we can say, oh, point to Lincoln. So now he was against what you're advocating for. He's the best president ever. Therefore, because he was against what you're talking about, therefore, what you're doing is bad. And so therefore, whatever the government does is good, because if you're against what the government's doing, you're anti this idol that we've created. And so it is vital for them to keep up this deification of Lincoln, because they need it to keep up and prop up the deification of government, the worship of government, the putting government as your idol, as the thing that you worship, as the thing that you obey. That's why we have these same individuals that are behind the deification of Lincoln and the deification of the government. They promote these ideas like Romans 13 is all about doing whatever the government says, and that you can't resist the government because resisting the government is resisting God, or that the 12th article of faith means that you obey the government no matter what. When that is not what Paul did, that's not what Joseph Smith did, that is not what the founding fathers did, the actual founding fathers, and that the legacy of Lincoln is the antithesis to the legacy that we find in the scriptures, the antithesis to the legacy that we find of the founding fathers. And so to overcome this, it's important. We have to overcome this literal cult of Lincoln. And so we have to recognize the idol of Lincoln, and that it was manufactured by the conspiracy to create America from what the founders formed to the tyranny that we have today. Okay, we got to recognize that that is what happened, and one of the major goals behind it. And that they've used Lincoln to rewrite history, to get the masses to worship at the altar of the state. And that we have to then therefore support the promotion of what the founders created, a confederation of sovereign independent republics with the ability to say no to the government, with the ability to enforce the contract as the creators of the contract. And that we must stand for the independence of the nation in which we reside, whether that's Utah, Arizona, Texas, Wyoming, Tennessee, whatever it is. We have to make sure that we are saying that we are going to stand for what the founding fathers created and what the Constitution created, and that the Constitution governs, and that it limits the power of the federal government and gives the ultimate power to its creator, the states. Also, joining with others, becoming a member of the Tree of Liberty Society to help us expose the lies and restore the knowledge of the truth, so that we can then restore a free society. If we are still worshiping at a false idol, if we are still promoting the lies that were behind this war and and behind Lincoln, then we will not be able to break free and be able to restore, because then we will still be stuck with this cognitive dissonance, this wondering, okay, we love Lincoln, he's the best thing ever, but we also say we want to have limited government and that the federal government can't do all these things. That those are two contradictory ideas, and to be able to stick to the Constitution, defend the Constitution, we have to get rid of the other idea. And so so our education efforts are what back up our action items to be able to stand up for liberty and to be able to stand up against the tyranny that is being attempted to be imposed upon us. And so with that, we close our training portion. Let me go back to our Zoom and give folks an opportunity to comment. Whatever comments or questions that anybody has, please use the hand, raise your hand, and